We're going to discuss how to configure your network so that you can communicate with your agents to transmit jobs between 3 different locations in this example. The dotted red line represents the locations, and each is assumed to be behind a firewall. Sending files between the servers within the local group that holds the job server is quite straightforward. Each machine can easily be identified by its computer name, which is the NetBIOS name, so that addressing is just that simple. The computer name is used as the default access name to get to those machines. Communicating with a remote location is still not that difficult. Assuming that they're not within the same domain, you can simply use a DNS address or an IP address to get to those various locations. The database on your SureSync machine will contain the configuration information for how to connect to the remote machines. Each of the local machines, such as L1 and L2, can use that configuration to reach the remote machines. This all works fine as long as all of the machines can access the remote groups using the DNS addresses and the ports that are configured. But this may not be the case. If you need R2 to transfer files to or from R1, you may need a special outbound connection from R2 or from R1 to get to the other machine. The database definitions would have the computer name and a default access name associated with each machine. Within the local group with the job server, each of those machines is most easily accessed by just using their computer name. Each machine can see the other one without any difficulty. To transmit to the remote locations, you're going to need a DNS name or an IP address in order to reach those machines. I've gone ahead and defined each machine that we've used in our example using the default parameters. This has created the 2 default listen connections under each machine. We're making an assumption that each of these remote machines can be accessed with its own external IP address instead of using port forwarding. That just makes our example a little bit easier right now. For each of these machines, we need to specify the DNS name that will be used by default to access each of these machines. If we click on the Options tab for each of the listen connections, down here we have the default access name. So this is the name that will be used by other machines to try to connect to this machine. We have the same thing here on the configuration connection, where we've defined the same name because we're the same machine. And this has to be done on each of the other machines as well. The job server needs to be able to send commands to each of the agents, so it needs a direct connection to each of those agents. This is accomplished using the definitions we just finished defining. The L1 and L2 machines, since they share the same characteristics of being in the local zone, can get to the remote machines using those same definitions. Things get a little more complicated if you want to transfer a file from R1 to L2. The definition in the database just has a computer name L2, which will mean nothing when R1 tries to send to it. To get around this problem, by default, R1 will send to the job server on the callback channel that the job server has established to the R1 machine. The job server, since it can access all machines, can then forward that data to the L2 machine. Note that this forwarding process does not store the file on job server. It's the communications routine that simply passes it through to its destination machine. A more efficient method of transferring a file from R1 to L2 would be to have R1 create a direct connection to L2. To define the desired connection, we need to define an outbound connection from R1 to L2. Think of the connections from the point of view of that machine. We will create an outbound connection here, and we will select the destination computer as L2, and then we have to pick how we're going to connect to that machine. These are the listening ports that are defined for L2. Let's use the data connection. And again, for simplicity, we're going to assume that we're not using port forwarding. And we'll reference an IP address. And that's all there is to it. We now have the connection defined, and this will be used instead of the default that's been previously defined on the R1 server here. Now we need to consider if the R2 and the R3 machines need to exchange files, all within location B. There's a couple of ways that this could be accomplished in the most efficient manner. It would be nice if they could simply refer to each other using their computer names. That conflicts, however, with the default definition that we may have placed in the job server for how to communicate directly with the R2 and R3 machines. So either we need to add an outbound connection to the R2 and R3 machines, or we go back to the job server and leave all of the definitions as the computer names and override the outbound connections for the job server to connect to the R1, R2, and R3 machines. In our original configuration, we defined each machine to have a DNS address on its listen ports. That works fine when the local group is transmitting to these remote machines, but this same name will be used as a default when trying to transmit between the R3 and R2 machines, and it's possible that that name can't be resolved within that remote group. So to get around that, we want to define an outbound connection that will override that default when we're talking from the R3 to the R2 machine. So we'll create a new outbound connection. Our destination here will be the R2 machine. We'll use the data connection, and instead of putting a DNS name here, we'll just put R2, which will be just the computer name. That'll be resolved within the local network and make that communication quite efficient because it does not have to pass through the SureSync machine in order to reach the R2 machine. The alternative is to use default access names on all of the machines in your configuration. And then you need to provide an overriding outbound connection for all machines that you will access when your machine is used as a source. In addition to that, the SureSync machine must always have a connection to all of the other machines, so it will need an outbound connection to each of those machines. And in these definitions here of the outbound connections, that's where you're going to specify a DNS name. So these outbound connections will override the defaults that were specified on the listen connections for the other machines. Once you've created your configuration, you'll want to test the connections to the different machines. This can be done in several different ways. On the server item itself, there is a Test Connections button. That button is going to connect from your current machine to the machine you're selected here. So it's going to try and send messages to the R3 machine from your current machine and send to each of the listen ports that are defined there. Another way to do this is to use the Options tab, and this works a little different. There's a Test Connection section here where you can pick a destination machine. So we can select R1 here, and this is going to send a request to the R3 machine. That's the one we've selected here, asking the R3 machine to connect to the R1 machine and report back the status of that connection. And so clicking the test connection button here will run that test. On each listen connection, you can also use a test button there. That button, similar to the one on the server, will go from your current machine to the R3 machine in this case, using just this specific connection. So it's going to try and go to this listen port. Outbound connections can be tested in a similar manner. If you click on an outbound connection, you'll find a test button there. This is going to work by sending the request to your machine. So it's going to send a request to the R3 machine to try and use this connection. Now this particular connection is going to try and connect to the L2 machine. So we're going to send the request to R3. It's going to try and connect to the L2 connection using the connection criteria that you have up here and report back the result. One last way of testing connections is on your job. So on the job itself, you'll have the route path connections defined, and there's a test button there. That is going to test from your current machine to the destination and check to see if the path exists or not. When you run a job, the configuration information needed by that job is published out to the agents that you're referencing. So the R1 and L2 machines will receive the connection information required to make the job run. You can also force publish out configuration information by going to the individual server and clicking Update Agent Configuration and restart the service. The restarting of the service is necessary if you change the listen ports. These listen ports are set up and used when the agent starts and can't be changed once it's already running. Outbound connections can be added if they've never been used, but typically you'll publish out in this manner if you don't let it automatically publish when you run your job. Please watch the other videos on communications for additional information.